Soldier, historian, orator, artist, he adorned the present and awoke the past. Winston Churchill is one of the key political figures of the 20th century, has always excited the imagination of compatriots and foreigners, and this is not surprising because he was an unusual person, woven of contradictions, a romantic and a realist, a slave of ambition who did not change his principles, and an adventurer who recognized the advantages of compromise. Rich political experience, unshakable patriotism, innate gift of eloquence, and tremendous energy of thought. Such a large number of advantages put Churchill above ordinary mortals, made him as attractive as extraordinary. But was his path to political Olympus easy? What issues did his parents instill in him? And what decision almost destroyed his brilliant career? You will learn about this and much more from our today's video on the Biographer History channel. Get comfortable and let's get started. Winston Leonard Spencer Churchill was born in 1874. In November, his mother, Lady Randolph Churchill, 7 months pregnant, slipped and fell while hunting in Blenheim. A few days later, she started having seizures while walking. She was rushed to the palace where her son was born in the early hours of November 30th. Winston is a traditional name in the Churchill family since the 17th century. It was this name that little Winston's paternal grandfather, the 7th Duke of Marlborough, bore. The boy was named Leonard after his maternal grandfather, Leonard Jerome. The double surname Spencer Churchill was formed as a result of an alliance concluded a long time ago. His ancestor, John Churchill, had no son heir, and when in 1700 he married his daughter to the son of another noble aristocratic family, Charles Spencer, Earl of Sunderland, the surname Spencer was officially added to the Churchill name. That is why Winston Churchill signed himself with the initials WSC. Winston Spencer Churchill. The future prime minister was born in exceptionally favorable social conditions. He was surrounded by an atmosphere of wealth, power, and the undeniable authority of the old landed aristocracy, among which the dukes occupied the highest level of the hierarchy. All doors were wide open for young Winston, who had been accustomed to luxury, honors, and respect since childhood. Winston's father, whom he admired endlessly, was an extraordinary but hot-tempered and quarrelsome person. Lord Randolph belonged to one of the noblest families in England, and at the age of 24 was elected as a Conservative MP for Woodstock, where his family estate was located. Winston's mother, Jenny Jerome, was the daughter of the great New York entrepreneur Leonard Jerome, nicknamed the King of Wall Street. After getting married, she immediately plunged headlong into social life. According to the custom accepted in high society, the parents did not raise little Winston. As soon as the child was born, he was immediately given to the nanny, who took over all the care of the child. Winston was lucky. The nanny who was chosen, a reliable woman of 40 years of age named Elizabeth Everest, had a deep affection for the baby, and Winston was also very attached to her. Her portrait hung in Churchill's bedroom throughout his life. Neither father nor mother, absorbed in worldly pursuits, did not devote much time to their son. Winston constantly lacked parental attention and warmth. This left a deep impression on his early childhood, which was spent in London and Dublin, where from 1877 to 1880 Lord Randolph held a position under the Viceroy and where Churchill's brother Jack was born in February. After his birth, the family returned to London. As a child, Winston was often cranky and already showed his strong-willed character. Mrs. Everest followed reasonable principles of education, and her boundless devotion replaced the boy's motherly love, which he lacked so much. It was Mrs. Everest who looked after me and tended all my wants. It was to her I poured out my many troubles. According to Churchill, the nanny constantly followed him and pampered him in every way, and especially told a lot about the distant lands of Kent County from which she came. From that time on, young Winston always wanted to live in Kent. He kept the most tender memories of her, and when he was already 50 years old, the deep gratitude of the nanny was reflected in his memories. My mother shone for me like the evening star. I loved her dearly, but at a distance. My nurse was my confidant. One of the boy's early memories was the accident which was called Tay Bridge disaster. In stormy weather, a bridge with a train running on it collapsed and all the passengers drowned. Even then, Winston witnessed the imperfection of the system. I accused the government of extreme frivolity and was not at all surprised that people decided to vote against those whose inaction and carelessness led to such a nightmare. He wrote in one of his monographs. Winston was 7 years old when his school life began. At first, the boy was sent to St. George School, which was located in a rich mansion in Ascot. Of course, no one asked Winston. Everyone around him was constantly telling him how great it was to go to school and what a pleasure it was for boys. For him, the fact of acquiring knowledge was disappointing. The only thing that warmed the boy's heart was the opportunity to get to know other boys and make joint pranks. There were also a few more pleasant moments, school gatherings, and such rare shared moments with his mother who took her son to the station. She gave me 3 half-crown coins, which I dropped on the floor of the taxi, and we dug through the straw looking for them. We just made it to the train. If we were late, it would be the end of the world. But we weren't late, and life went on. Churchill remembered that day. The school to which the boy was sent was considered the most prestigious and fashionable in the country. It was something like the famous Eton and was last word in school education at that time. It appears that I was to go away from home for many weeks at a stretch in order to do lessons under masters. After all, I was only 7, and I had been so happy in my nursery with all my toys. But in the end, his fears were justified. Unfortunately, the boarding school adhered to traditional views on pedagogy, so special attention was paid to rote learning and corporal punishment. According to the Eton model, whipping was the most important point in the curriculum, recalled William. No correctional institution of the Foreign Secretary Office would allow such cruel punishments. Several times a month, the whole school was gathered and lined up in the library. Then they chose 2 or 3 boys who were the guiltiest and sent them with the older schoolboys, who whipped them to blood. Unsurprisingly, Winston did not like his first school, as evidenced by the unflattering characteristics received by Churchill as an undisciplined, overeating, and sloppy pupil. How I hated this school, and what a life of anxiety I lived there for more than 2 years. I counted the days and the hours to the end of every term when I should return home from this hateful servitude. Where my reason, imagination, or interests were not engaged, I would not or I could not learn. In all the 12 years I was at school, no one ever succeeded in making me write a Latin verse or learn any Greek. But despite the rigors of his studies, Winston already showed firmness of character. If he didn't like the subject, he didn't learn it, and nothing could make him do it. He was good in history and geography, especially in history, but the behavior was characterized as follows. Extremely unsatisfactory. He cannot be trusted with anything, and his lateness to lessons, 20 times in 40 days of study, is extremely shameful. He constantly creates difficulties for others and constantly gets into various troubles. His behavior can never be vouched for. But even the director of St. George School could not fail to note that the boy was very gifted. At school, he constantly asked his mother to visit him, but in vain. At best, Lady Randolph would send Mrs. Everest to him with his brother Jack. Due to insufficient attention from his parents, Winston felt very lonely. "It is very bad of you," he wrote in one of his letters to his mother, "not to write to me. Since the beginning of the semester, I have received only 1 letter from you." From childhood, Churchill showed a harshness of character, but bad behavior from the point of view of teachers could be interpreted relatively, especially considering the modern realities of education. One day, Winston was severely punished for eating sugar in the cafeteria. For that, he did not feel sorry. Instead, he tore the director's straw hat. Troubles at school were aggravated by poor health, which also greatly worried his parents. It was because of his unsatisfactory physical condition that it was decided to transfer Winston to another school, preparatory school in Hove, neighboring Brighton, which was ran in a very different manner by 2 sisters, Kate and Charlotte Thompson. Studying in a new place was not too peaceful either. During a drawing exam between Churchill and the boys sitting next to him began a conflict over a paper cutter that the teacher had given them to work with. Winston grabbed his opponent by the ear and he, without thinking long, used the object of the conflict against him. As a result, Churchill received a penetrating wound in the chest, but it turned out not very serious. So his parents were not particularly concerned about that incident, believing that their son was to blame for what happened. Winston remained in Brunswick School for 4 years, shunning his friends as before. But here, in a school that was smaller and simpler than the previous one, the boy found the compassion and kindness of his mentors. Despite his weak health, he strengthened himself physically and engaged in the subjects that interested him most: French, history, poetry, horse riding, and swimming. As for his grades for academic performance and behavior, they have hardly changed. He was last in French, English, and mathematics. Behavior, according to the report card, left much to be desired. Lady Randolph still did not spoil her son with attention. In letters, the boy often wrote to his mother asking her to come to him, and during one of the school holidays, he asked her to join them with Jack and Mrs. Everest on a vacation at sea. "Come and see us sooner," Churchill persuaded his mother in mid-August. "Will you come?" Lady Randolph did not respond to the request, instead arranging for a governess to work with him in the school program during the holidays, which became an additional burden for Winston and a factor in the conflict with his parents. He protested desperately, but in vain. Mr. Churchill, who was completely immersed in work, did not pay much attention to his son either. "I can't understand why you didn't stop by when you were in Brighton," Winston wrote in another letter. "I was very upset, but you must have been too busy." For the high society of that time, education and discipline were key in upbringing. Throughout his school life, Winston would be constantly pressured by his parents to improve his grades and behavior. A peculiar way of influencing their son was financially. Since studying in Brighton, the young man often asked his mother for money, and Lady Randolph would repeatedly scold her son and complain about his extravagance. Mrs. Everest also noticed her ward's tendency to take money lightly. A few years later, she wrote to him, "I think you are extremely spendthrift, spending 15 shillings a week," she wrote. "Some families of 6 or even 7 people are forced to live on 12 shillings a week. You just waste money, and the more money you have, the more you spend. My poor, sweet, precious lamb. How I long to hold you. Although you are not perfect, I love you very much, and I really want you to show restraint and discretion in spending." As soon as his success went better, his father sent him some money. As soon as things got worse, he was immediately left with empty pockets. After Brighton, Churchill entered one of the most famous private schools in England, Harrow, which was equal to the famous Eton. As in previous schools, he became a boarder and saw his parents only during the holidays, and even then, not always. Traveling often, they left their children with nannies and governesses. Even on holidays, they were absent for months. The young man really wanted to enter Harrow and diligently prepare for the exams. Despite this, the entrance exams were not easy for him. "I'm very tired, but now it doesn't matter because I got in. I really wanted to go to Harrow. It's great there. Great scenery, great location, nice swimming pool, good gym, carpentry shop, and much more," he wrote to his mother. And in another letter, he wrote, "I really want to celebrate Easter with you. Come back soon." But she never came by Easter. During the first year, Churchill showed great success in his studies. Churchill's first paper at Harrow was devoted to the Palestine of the time of John the Budapest, when the land, as he put it, lay at the feet of the Romans, who were then in the zenith of glory. It's interesting that even as a child, he considered imperialist interests from both sides, supporting the zealots who were ready to risk their lives, their homes, everything for the sake of the freedom of their country. He wrote about the Pharisees. "They had many faults. Who doesn't have enough of them? To claim as a Christian that they are more sinful is to commit the very crime of which they are accused. But the behavior was, as usual, not satisfactory enough. Judge for yourself whether the young man did something out of spite." Assistant Principal Henry Davidson wrote to Lady Randolph, "It is with regret that I have to state that Winston's behavior is getting worse during the semester. He is constantly late for classes, loses textbooks, notebooks, etc. Sometimes I think he just doesn't control himself. If he cannot overcome this handicap, he will never succeed in a private educational institution. Finally, I can't help but say that I am very satisfied with the history work he's completed on my assignment." In his own words, the boy confessed to his mother in the letter, "I'm doing as much as I can, but you're so angry with me that I feel stupid," and adding, "My dear Mama, come on Saturday. I am not lazy and untidy, but careless and forgetful." Of course, she never came, even during Winston's performance in the school choir. But when his son's affairs got better, his father gave him a bicycle. Unfortunately, that only led to more problems. After riding it for several kilometers, he fell and got a concussion. Mrs. Everest arrived at Harrow immediately, but Winston was more interested in seeing his mother, who was still ignoring her son in every possible way. But his father came a year later. During his visit, he expressed his desire to transfer his son from ordinary to military class. But because the military class had additional subjects required for admission to the military academy, Churchill lost the opportunity to study the subjects required for admission to the university. And that's exactly what he didn't want. According to the results of the semester, Churchill could expect to successfully pass the university entrance exams, but Lord Randolph believed that the son should serve in the army, therefore study in a military class. Why? It was all because of one incident in childhood. For many years, I believed that my father, with his experience and intuition, saw military talents in me, but then I was told that he came to this decision only because he did not see me as a lawyer. Winston failed the examination for the military class because he showed unsatisfactory results in mathematics, which made his prospects for admission to Woolwich, an academy for cadets who were going to serve in the artillery or engineer troops, doubtful. Instead, he could train at Sandhurst, an academy that trained infantry and cavalry officers. Thinking about the future, Churchill said, "If I had 2 lives, I would be a soldier and a politician. But as there will be no war in my time, I shall have to be a politician." Even then, those around them began to notice Winston's charisma. Like other students, another Harrow graduate, Merlin Evans, later recalled, "I was extremely attracted to this unusual boy. His outstanding intelligence, courage, charm, disregard for conventions, vivid imagination, extensive knowledge of the world and history, obtained inexplicably how and where, and above all, a certain magnetism that shines in his eyes and radiates from his whole personality. All this, even in the harsh conditions of private school, put him above those around him, although many were both older and more experienced. But no one denied it." In addition, Winston began to read voraciously. His writing and speaking abilities bore fruit very quickly. Already at an early age, Winston wrote essays with which he won competitions and gave public speeches at school, took an active part in debates and speeches. He showed a tendency to express his own opinions, even if they contradicted the generally accepted ideas. His determination and the artistry of his speeches defined him as a gifted speaker and an expresser of his own beliefs. However, despite his academic success, Winston suffered from bouts of deep depression. From childhood until his last days, depression was a decisive factor that determined his actions, although in most cases Churchill managed to hide his illness. He was aware that he was prone to mental pathology, and even called it a black dog because it invariably accompanied him on days of failure. Psychiatrist Anthony Starr, who carefully studied Churchill's case, found in his depression a source of insatiable ambition and seething activity. It is not difficult to trace these psychological features in the development of Churchill's character. The lack of parental warmth and the feeling of loneliness in early childhood traumatized his soul. Since then, he was desperate to succeed by any means necessary to make up for the lack of love and overcome the feelings of insecurity that haunted him. Churchill's exploits should serve as proof of extraordinary abilities and talents for others and for himself. In a word, only general recognition could convince this person of his importance. From now on, admiration and love for him needed to be immeasurable. As immeasurable was the suffering of a rejected child. After the son twice failed the entrance exams at Sandhurst, Lord Randolph took Winston from Harrow, where the young man left without any regrets, and assigned him to a London crammer, something like a bachelor factory called Captain James Institution. In this glorious alma mater, where studies were conducted with surprising vigor, positive results were guaranteed even from the most disobedient students. Despite the fact that at the beginning of his studies, Winston was reprimanded for violation of discipline, inattention, and tendency to educate teachers, in the end he was forced to submit to a regime of intensive cramming. Now the teachers show the greatest interest in me and say that I'm doing very well. If you believe my honest words that I am doing everything in my power, fine. If not, well, so be it, he explained in a letter to his mother. And 6 months later, the long-awaited success did come. The evening before the exam, Churchill wrote 25 names on pieces of paper, threw them into his hat, closed his eyes, and took out one sheet. It was New Zealand, he told his mother. And I got it in the exam. Luck, along with hard work of the last months, paid off. He passed the exams in all subjects. But his parents did not support him. After the entrance results were announced, Winston received a letter from his father. It contained neither congratulations nor support. "I am very surprised," he wrote, "by your exultation in connection with going to Sandhurst. Don't expect me to take it upon myself to write you long letters after every stupid thing or mistake you do now or in the future. And later, I no longer care about the fact that you will inform me of your achievements and exploits. Make sure that if your behavior and actions at Sandhurst are similar to those in other institutions where they tried in vain to give you at least some education, then I remove all responsibility from myself." According to his father's letter, Winston had only himself to rely on, receiving from him the minimum support necessary to ensure a basic existence. Churchill's biographers justify Randolph's behavior with illness, namely syphilis, which clouded his mind. It's unknown how it actually happened, but of course, the father's letter upset the boy very much. So much so that his tutor was forced to personally write to Churchill Sr. and reprimand him for the situation. On the 28th of June, 1893, Winston was admitted to Sandhurst, but only as a cavalry cadet, as his result in the entrance examinations was 92 out of a possible 102, mainly due to low grades in Latin. And in the infantry troops, much stricter requirements were imposed on the training of cadets. Winston was quite strong in history and English. He started learning French early and achieved excellent results. Then he developed the habit of embellishing his spoken and written English with French expressions, and later the opportunity to speak French always brought him pleasure. The training was going well, and Winston's letters at this time were filled with enthusiasm. Despite this, his father continued to complain to his son. "I am very sorry that Papa does not like my letters," Churchill wrote to his mother. "I work on them and often even rewrite whole pages, but if I describe my life in detail here, I am told that my style is too sentimental and high-minded. If at other times I write clearly and simply, it is regarded as laziness. I never get it right. By the way, I have to say that I behave extremely well. I'm never late, and I always show up 5 minutes before the start of lineup or class." At Sandhurst, Winston spent just over a year wearing the blue uniform of a cadet. He had fond memories of that time. In the chosen society of Her Majesty's future officers, Churchill felt at his best. He obeyed the strict discipline without complaining, willingly performed all the necessary exercises. At first, however, his mentors complained about his chronic tardiness, but that habit remained with Churchill for the rest of his life. The college schedule was as follows: getting up at 6 in the morning, a lesson in using weapons, marches, inspections, maneuvers, physical training, riding, theoretical course. In general, Winston's set of disciplines suited him, despite the fact that the result of such intensive training was constant fatigue and nervous tension. After all, Churchill could never boast of excellent health. He was a sickly young man, shorter than the average height, but at the same time, as a child, the headstrong Winston often caused trouble for Mrs. Everest. In college, Winston began to smoke heavily, preferring cigars and drinking alcohol, however, in moderation. Meanwhile, Cadet Churchill's grades were getting better every month, and on the final exam, his result was already 20 out of 130 possible. Shortly before graduating from the Royal Military College, an interesting story happened with Churchill. In search of entertainment, he and his friends from Sandhurst occasionally visited London's music halls. He also visited one of the most famous, which was called Empire Leicester Square, that was located in the very center of London's red light district. Among the visitors of the bar and the dancers of the Empire Corps de Ballet, there were many easygoing ladies. A controversy erupted in front of this institution in connection with the struggle for the purity of character, started by a group of activists. In response to this protest, Winston placed an article in the Westminster Gazette, tentatively initialed. In it, he asserted that in order to instill virtue in society, first of all, it is necessary to improve social living conditions and develop education, and not to listen with open mouths to hypocritical nonsense. However, Empire had to close the bar and cancel the performances of the Corps de Ballet. Then Churchill, enlisting the support of several cadets, decided to organize a grand demonstration which took place on November 3, 1894. Dressed in tailcoats, rioters took over the music hall and overturned the shields blocking access to the restricted area. In the midst of the commotion, Churchill made an impromptu speech that caused quite a stir. At the beginning of the speech, he announced his credo: "Ladies of the Empire, I am a defender of freedom." Of course, the scandal caused by this noisy party was immediately picked up by the press. A letter from the Bishop of London was published in the Times, in which he sarcastically commented on this event. "I would never have thought that a descendant of Marlborough would have such success among prostitutes." Shortly after this incident, Winston passed his final exams at Sandhurst and was commissioned as a second lieutenant on February 20th, 1895. He was enrolled in one of the most brilliant regiments of the English Army, the 4th Queen's Own Hussars. 1895 was a turning point in Churchill's life. He said goodbye to youth and entered adulthood. In that year, Winston experienced 2 heavy losses that deeply affected him. In January, Lord Randolph died, and despite the fact that he had always treated his son rather harshly, Winston suddenly reduced the image of his father to a cult of personality. And a few years later, Churchill even dedicated a detailed and talented biography to him. I conceived an intense admiration and affection for him, and, after his death, for his memory, I read industriously almost every word he had ever spoken, and learnt by heart large portions of his speeches. Another death also left an unforgettable mark on Winston's heart. His nanny, Mrs. Everest, died in July of peritonitis. The poor woman fell into poverty when 2 years before, the Churchill family refused her services because their sons had grown up and she was no longer needed. But despite everything, the nanny, until her last breath, as before, surrounded her dear Winston with tender care. She knew she was in danger, he later recalled, but all her thoughts were about me. I arrived in heavy rain. The coat was wet. After touching it, she was terribly worried that I would catch a cold. I had to take off my coat. She calmed down only after it was completely dry. Winston tried to help her to the last. He called a nurse and called a doctor he knew, but despite his efforts, Miss Everest died. "It is very sad," he wrote. "Her death was a real blow to me, but I don't think she was in pain." With the death of loved ones and the beginning of a military career, a new phase began in Churchill's life, which he entered with his usual speed and thirst for action. This is evidenced by his insightful advice that he gave to the younger generation in an episode of his autobiography. Don't give up for a second. At the same time and decisively, take a position on the battlefield whose name is life. Don't be satisfied with the existence. Never accept defeat, because the world exists to be conquered. Do you follow Churchill's instructions in your everyday life? Do you think his words are correct? Tell us about it in the comments. It will be interesting to know your opinion, and we'll continue. Already in the first months of his service in the 4th Queen's Own Hussars Regiment, Junior Lieutenant Churchill realized that the military profession was not for him, although he served, as before, with pleasure. "The longer I serve, the more I like to serve, but the more I am convinced that it is not for me." His regiment was stationed at Aldershot, a small garrison town 50 kilometers southwest of London. Despite the many hours of daily riding exercises, military duties, Winston had the opportunity to enjoy his free moments. Besides, he was often on leave. This allowed him to easily maintain acquaintances in the capital, as well as to visit the military commanders in the barracks. The social position of the son of Lord Randolph Churchill allowed him to receive and accompany distinguished guests, starting with the Prince of Wales and his son, the future king, King George V, and ending with the Duke of Cambridge, the commander-in-chief of the army. At the same time, the young man still dreamed of distant countries and adventures that would make him famous. However, at this time, Winston had to face financial difficulties. The life of a cavalry officer was not cheap. To maintain the honor of the uniform required £600 a year, and his salary was $150. In addition, young Winston, as a true aristocrat, was not used to counting money and spent it without thinking. Year after year, the situation worsened, at least until the reporting of Churchill's soldier journalist began to bring him a solid income. But we'll talk about the journalistic career later. Nevertheless, the habit of reckless spending remained with Winston for the rest of his life. Back in Aldershot, Winston escaped from the monotonous everyday life of the garrison and started a very risky adventure. He asked for a long leave of absence and went to Cuba to fight the rebels protesting against Spanish rule. During this trip, the young man visited the USA for the first time, and his impression of the Americans and their culture made an indelible impact on him. "This is a big country, dear Jack," Churchill wrote to his brother on the 5th day of his stay in New York. "Not cute and not romantic, but big and pragmatic. There seems to be no such thing as tradition here. Everything is subordinated to practicality to the highest degree and is evaluated only from this point of view." Sympathy for the American system of global influence would only strengthen further. The campaign lasted only a few weeks, but during this time, Winston managed to receive a baptism of fire. He fought in the front ranks next to the Spanish general, the commander of the expedition. For his courage, Winston received the Spanish Order of the Red Cross and was over the moon with happiness. Then, Winston took the first steps in journalism, sending a story about his Cuban adventures to a daily graphic. Churchill's 5 correspondences were titled Letters from the Front and signed with the initials WSC. Even then, he tried to objectively assess not only the military, but also the political situation in the region, noting the determination of the Cuban rebels to liberate their people. In his letters, one could feel affection and loyalty to the people's struggle for self-determination and independence. "The more I see of Cuba," he wrote, "the more I feel sure that the demand for independence is national and unanimous. The insurgent forces contain the best blood in the island and can by no possible perversion of the truth be classed as banditti. In fact, it is a war, not a rebellion. Cuba has been burdened with terrible taxes for a long time. The Spaniards pumped so much money out of the country that the entire industry was paralyzed and development became impossible. Bribery and corruption pervaded the administration on an almost Chinese scale. The entire Spanish administration was corrupt. A national uprising is the only possible result of the existence of such a system." At the same time, he added, "The Cubans chose the wrong way to fight for independence, choosing the tactics of robbers. "States are not created this way," he summarized. After his material on Cuba was published by the Saturday Review, Lady Randolph sent a copy to Joseph Chamberlain, one of the most influential figures of the time. Chamberlain was impressed. In his opinion, it was the best summary of the problems the Spaniards had to face, and one that was consistent with his own conclusions. This is proof that Mr. Winston knows how to look both ways. He did so for many years and was successful as a military correspondent. By the way, the first typewriter was represented to him in 1893 when Winston was 19 years old. For Churchill, who became a soldier reporter, it was a double stroke of luck. First, Churchill finally found a reliable source of income that brought him a solid profit, especially since the fees increased as his popularity grew. On the other hand, it was a great opportunity for the young man to become famous. In his stories about fantastic adventures on a distant island, Winston gave free rein to his imagination. In addition, his notes were imbued with sincere patriotism. Thanks to this successful combination, as well as his excessive ambition and journalistic abilities, and of course, a favorable coincidence of circumstances, Winston's popularity among his compatriots exceeded his own expectations. Later, he was promoted to the rank of national hero. When our cavalryman learned a year later that his regiment would be sent to India, he was seriously upset, because in this country he would be doomed to a quiet garrison life, and he dreamed of exploits so much. Indeed, in October 1896, the 4th Queen's Own Hussars Regiment was stationed in Bengaluru, in the south of the peninsula. The officers were comfortably accommodated, and they were not burdened by the troubles associated with everyday life. Junior Lieutenant Churchill occupied a spacious house where he even had several servants. In the morning, he did the necessary exercises, and in the afternoon, he usually played polo. Churchill was passionate about this game, which allowed him to maintain good physical shape and at the same time served as a kind of entertainment and a means of communication. Here in India, the young man found his first love. Pamela Plowden, the daughter of a local Brighton, became the lady of the heart. "I have to say, I have never met a more beautiful lady," he admitted to his mother. "We are going to go to Hyderabad together on an elephant." Love did not work out for the couple, though. Despite Winston's feelings, Pamela did not take the courtship seriously, considering the young man windy and incapable of serious feelings. Once he even reproached a young woman, writing, "I am not a windy suitor who follows fleeting passions. My love is deep and strong, and nothing will change that. I do not rule out that I will exchange it for small things, but most of it will remain unchanged. Unchanged until death." The communication between Pamela and Winston would continue for years to come, and the man himself would often write to the woman, telling about his adventures. What were all those years of feelings for her? 55 years later, Churchill wrote to Pamela, "I've been keeping your image all these years, since I was a young brat, but I met a person who saw some advantages in me." Despite this, Winston was bored. He was burdened by the monotony of garrison life, and his dreams were carried far from the peninsula. He began to devote all his free time to reading and self-education. He admired not only the classics of literature, but also political and philosophical treatises, and from time to time he looked into literary theory and criticism. Gradually, he significantly replenished the stock of knowledge, and then more than once surprised his interlocutors with his intelligence. From this period, the young man's active interest in a political career began. In his letters to his mother, he repeatedly mentioned that if he were in London, he would definitely try his hand at the elections. When he found out about the parliamentary vacancy in East Bradford, he was sure he would win. Winston opposed increasing military spending on the military, arguing that it would affect the nation's prosperity and well-being. But he was already asserting that Britain's strength lay in the fleet, which would consolidate its superiority over a coalition of any two states. With the undisputed mastery of the sea, he believed, there was no part of the British Empire which the present army could not defend. But without the mastery of the sea, there was no part which could be held by any army twice as large. We'll see this rhetoric later, and this position of his in the future will be one of the turning points in his career. In addition to literature devoted to history, economics, and the formation of statehood, the young Churchill began writing the Annual Register of World Events, in which, while reading reports of parliamentary speeches, he made notes with his own thoughts and comments. He came up with a special method for this. First, he wrote down his own opinion, based only on general considerations, then read the report, reflected, and wrote down his opinion on this topic again with a pencil on small pieces of paper and put the pieces in a book. I hope to build up a scaffolding of logical and consistent views which will perhaps tend to the creation of a logical and consistent mind. Of course, the annual register is valuable only for its facts. A good knowledge of these will arm me with a sharp sword. Macaulay, Gibbon, Plato, etc. must train the muscles to wield that sword to the greatest effect. In the summer of 1897, Winston, having received an additional vacation, spent time in London. He was lucky enough to be present at the grand celebrations of Queen Victoria's Diamond Jubilee. In London, Winston learned of the unrest that had broken out on India's northwestern frontier and the highlands that divided the possessions of the British, Russian, and Chinese empires. Winston saw the news as a chance to advance his career and sent numerous telegrams to the military leadership begging to be included in the expeditionary force tasked with the operation. The Malakand Field Force, as this corps was called, faced the task of capturing the Malakand valleys. It was a hard-to-reach area on the border between India and Afghanistan. It was necessary to pacify the rebellious local tribes, mainly the Mohmans, who had declared a holy war. Churchill was enrolled in the Expeditionary Corps as a soldier and not an officer at all, as he had requested, although he had no choice but to pick up the pen again and conclude a contract with the Daily Telegraph, which published his notes with a vivid description of eastern landscapes and a dynamic plot. However, the government forces suffered heavy losses, and eventually, in October 1897, Winston was commissioned as a second lieutenant in the 31st Punjab Indian Infantry. The hostilities lasted for several weeks. Ambushes were arranged and repressive measures were carried out against nomadic tribes that besieged British posts. In fact, it was a vile colonial war, bloody, with manifestations of brutality on both sides. Probably Lieutenant Churchill was aware of that and could not but feel aversion to such methods of conducting military operations. In contrast to his published works, articles, and the book The Story of the Malakand Field Force, written on their basis, published in March 1898, in his letters he repeatedly mentioned the cruelty and bloodshed of those battles. All the time that Churchill was on the northwestern border, he behaved very carelessly. He constantly put his life in danger, was always in the center of events, and flaunted his bravery. 3 times he had the opportunity to brag under the crossfire in front of the general and his officers and thereby earn their praise. Churchill did not receive a medal for bravery at the time, but he was thanked in the order, and this also pleased his pride quite a bit. Why risk life like that? The answer to this can be partially revealed by a letter from Winston to his brother. Having repeatedly shown myself to be a coward, especially at school, there is no other goal for which I am so eager as to win the reputation of a man of courage. And who knows, maybe the speaker's eye will follow my good gray pony. Since then, Churchill has developed a unique strategy. No matter where military operations are taking place, no matter where an armed conflict breaks out, hurry there and take an active part in what is happening. And all with the sole purpose, to draw attention to himself, to make people talk about him, to try to become famous with a weapon in his hands, or at least participate in events as a military correspondent. In addition to the fact that Winston's military reports that appeared in newspapers brought him success, he realized that based on these notes he could write real books that could attract the attention of the general public. Thus, his first major work, The Story of the Malakand Field Force, written in 7 weeks, was favorably received by critics, and 9,000 copies of the book were sold within a year. That is why Winston next went to the Nile Valley. His love for the East and fascination with history were evident. Beginning in 1896, the Anglo-Egyptian expedition conducted active military operations in the Nile Valley, slowly advancing south. The expedition, commanded by General Kitchener, had the goal of reconquering Sudan. Lieutenant Churchill was assigned to the 21st Lancers and immediately hurried to Cairo to catch up with the army on the Upper Nile in August, on the eve of the decisive offensive. At the same time, Winston concluded a contract with the Morning Post to which he sent notes about the progress of the operation. The battle was bloody, and after the British victory, Kitchener's army continued to advance south down the Nile. In mid-September, it reached Fashoda. At this time, Winston's notes appeared in the Morning Post, and Winston himself resigned in May of the following year, deciding to finally pursue a political career. His reports, which appeared in London newspapers, sowed excitement among citizens. After all, already in Churchill's first book, The Story of the Malakand Field Force, there were episodes in which the author openly criticized the action of the command. Not without irony, some suggested calling the book Advice of a Junior Officer to Generals. However, the majority attributed this audacity to the proud character of the young aristocrat who was eager to make himself known. However, this time his rather sharp criticism of the command in the Sedan campaign dealt a tangible blow, not only to the general staff, but also to the entire army as a whole. Decent society was not jokingly outraged by the audacity of this lieutenant who allowed himself to teach seniors by rank, and even the Prince of Wales, who adored Winston, was forced to make an admonition to him. On the basis of reports from the scene of events, Churchill decided to write a large historical paper of 1,000 pages about Sedan and the last quarter of a century, called The River War. The book was published in November 1899, and the criticism in it was also aimed at Commander-in-Chief Kitchener himself, Winston's almost sworn enemy. The development of a political career had to be temporarily postponed, because no sooner had the Egyptian adventure ended successfully than the atmosphere became tense again. Now, at the other end of the empire. From the moment when gold deposits were discovered in South Africa in 1886, tensions between Great Britain and the Boer republics of Orange and Transvaal were constantly growing. In 1899, the crisis reached its peak. The war, which seemed to be the only way out, was unleashed on November 11th. Despite all expectations for a quick resolution of the conflict, it lasted for 3 years. Winston had long been attracted to these distant lands, and he, having agreed in advance with the editor of the Morning Post, offered his services as a military correspondent and signed the most profitable contract. The 25-year-old man was to receive a fee of £1,000 for 4 months. The newspaper also paid all his travel expenses. And so, 2 days after the start of hostilities, Winston sailed to Cape Town on the same ship with the commander-in-chief and his staff. After his arrival on October 31st, the lucky soldier was also appointed a lieutenant in one of the active regiments of the British Army. Having just got off the steamer, Winston immediately left for Natal. There he was captured and imprisoned in Pretoria, in a school building converted into a prison for captured British officers. He called that experience the biggest humiliation in his life, and the most difficult thing for him was the inability to continue his journalistic activities. "The new century," wrote Churchill, "will witness a great war for personality. It's terribly boring in prison. The body is closed. When great events occur, history occurs. A history that, please note, I must record. I'm 25 today. It's terrible to think how little time remains." After the death of his father, he constantly feared that the same fate would overtake him and that he would not live to see his 50th birthday. From the moment of his capture, Winston thought only of escape, and on the night of December 13th, he did manage to get beyond the camp's defensive structures. However, when he was released, he was left alone with a pitiful amount of money and a few bars of chocolate in his pocket. The nearest area controlled by Allied Portuguese troops was 500 kilometers away. Jumping on a freight train, Winston left the city, and the next night, thanks to a lucky chance, the very first house he knocked on turned out to be the house of an Englishman, the director of a coal mine. The owner took Winston to the tunnel where he hid for 3 days. Then, Winston sneaked onto a train and, hiding among bales of wool, arrived safely in Mozambique. Reaching Lourenço Marquis on December 21st, he immediately went to the British Council, then telegraphed to the Morning Post and sailed for Durban. A large crowd gathered on the wharf. People joyfully waved English flags, congratulating the hero who miraculously escaped. The orchestra played patriotic marches.
"I'm Winston bloody Churchill, and I'm free!"
Winston met Christmas already at the army headquarters and on the front line. He was enlisted as a lieutenant in the South African Light Horse Regiment. Suddenly, Churchill became famous and was greeted everywhere by crowds of supporters. The town of Ladysmith, besieged by the rebels since the beginning of the campaign, was liberated on February 28th. In his articles for the Morning Post, Churchill so vividly described the entry into the city of British connections as if he himself had participated in it. In fact, he was there only a few hours later, and in just a few weeks the siege of Mafeking was lifted, and Colonel Baden-Powell became the second hero after Winston of this war, which found a vivid response in the hearts of the English. Now military operations were unfolding on the territory of the Boer republics, and Churchill, after numerous adventures, during which he had to risk his life more than once, took part in the triumphal entry into Pretoria on June 5th. There, first of all, he hastened to release his compatriots from his former prison. After that, Winston decided that the war correspondent's mission was over, so he hurried to leave South Africa. This time, his adventures in distant countries were over. Churchill returned to normal life. In May, his story about the South African Odyssey, London to Ladysmith via Pretoria, was published in London. 14 copies of the book, in which the author used most of the articles printed in the Morning Post, sold out in a few months. A second collection of reports on the continuation of the Boer War, entitled Ian Hamilton's March, appeared in October. Many of those who encountered Churchill intuitively felt that he was a man of impressive abilities. "Proud to meet you," wrote the ship's gunner, Captain Percy Scott. "You made an amazing career without any patronage. I have no doubt that the day will come when I'll shake your hand as Prime Minister of England. You have two necessary qualities for this: talent and diligence. Such a combination, in my opinion, knows no obstacles." At the beginning of 1901, the 25-year-old Winston became a member of the Parliament. In the autumn 1900 general election, he was elected Conservative MP for Oldham, a working-class town in Lancashire. Winston won over voters with his exploits in South Africa. However, this was not Winston's first political appearance. He had already made 2 or 3 speeches at Conservative meetings, and most importantly, he had already tried his luck at Oldham in July 1899 at a by-election, but lost. However, in 1900, the political atmosphere in Oldham had changed markedly, and the Conservatives easily won the election. Churchill was extremely popular in his constituency, not so much because of his circumstances as because of his fame as a hero of the Transvaal. The main themes of his campaign speeches were war, patriotism, and the greatness of the empire. Finally, on October 1st, 1900, Winston was elected by a margin of 16 votes. The beginning of Churchill's political career was promising. His first speech in Parliament, which he delivered on February 18th, was a great success. Winston thought it best to immediately take an independent position, the position of a statesman who represents the people and not a particular party. He did not hesitate to criticize the government's military policy, drawn up by the Conservative Secretary of State for War, St. John Brodrick. Winston spoke about the senselessness of the planned reforms, the implementation of which would cost the country too much. In his opinion, it would be more expedient to make the Navy the core of the Army and to support it in every way than to have unrealistic hopes for land forces. In 1903, Churchill published a book devoted to this topic, Mr. Brodrick's Army. At the same time, he joined the wing of Conservative deputies who fought for social reforms, seeing in the young reformers the core of progressive politics. However, starting from 1903, when the question of a return to protectionism arose, the opinions of politicians were divided. Joseph Chamberlain became an advocate of government control, and on May 15, 1903, in his speech, he offered an end to free trade. This proposal sowed confusion in the close-knit ranks of conservatives and unionists and forever split the ruling majority. Churchill took the position of a convinced supporter of free trade. He believed that this was the most profitable way of economic development, capable of bringing the country to prosperity. Winston became a real rebel in the Tory camp, and by the end of 1903, he had long conversations with Lloyd George about his political future and was increasingly voting as a true liberal. On May 31, 1904, Winston took a decisive step. He switched from one party to another. In January 1906, Winston's new book, A Biography of His Father, was published. They were 2 thick volumes, every line of which breathed filial reverence. Although many facts were given in the book, the author clearly idealized Lord Randolph. The father's harshness and whims were not mentioned in the book, and the son ignored the gloom and unpleasant aspects of his character. However, the book's composition and the author's style were impeccable, and when the biography saw the light, critics spoke about it exceptionally favorably. Since Winston had burned the bridges that connected him with the Conservatives and joined the Liberals, he had to look for a new constituency. Among numerous proposals from the Liberal Party committees, Winston chose Northwest Manchester. The residents of this district were wealthy citizens, supporters of free trade. He found their warm support, arguing that it was not he who had changed, but the Conservative Party. In the January 1906 legislative election, Winston won a landslide victory with 56% of the vote, a margin of 1,200 votes over his opponent. By the end of 1905, the state of health of Arthur James Balfour, the head of the Conservative government, no longer allowed him to fulfill his duties. Then, Henry Campbell Bannerman, the leader of the Liberal Party, was appointed Prime Minister. In the government formed by him, Churchill assumed the position of Under Secretary of State for the colonies. For the ambitious Winston, this transition from Parliament to the government, despite the fact that he only got a modest post of an undersecretary, was a key moment in his political career. After all, he did not just find himself in power, he was preparing to make a rapid ascent to the political Olympus, having completed a training course with the best specialists. Churchill's first task on taking office was the status of South Africa, the responsibility of which rested entirely on him. In particular, he had to decide the fate of the Boer republics, joined in 1902, to determine the nature of relations between the British and the Afrikaners. The former president of Pretoria believed that further policy in the region should be generous, that no distinction should be made between British settlers and defeated Boers. As a result, in the summer of 1906, the Orange Province and the Transvaal were granted autonomy. Churchill was at his best as Under-Secretary of State for the colonies, carrying out the mission entrusted to him by the Liberal government. He believed that the position that England occupied in the world was key to its domestic political situation. In March 1908, Churchill was invited to a dinner party. At the last moment, a young Scottish aristocrat, Clementine Hozier, was invited there. This was the beginning of a real passion, but Winston felt awkward, carefully warning the lady of the heart that he was not very good at dealing with women. On August 7, 1908, he invited her in a letter to Blenheim and made a hint that could not be missed. "I want to show you this beautiful palace. In its gardens we will find many places suitable for conversation, and you and I have something to talk about." And the very next day, another one, in which he wrote about the strange mystery of her eyes, which he was never able to solve, and further about the fact that he is awkward and uncomfortable in this regard, used to being self-sufficient and relying only on himself. By all the rules of the Edwardian era, he should have proposed to her. Clementine came for a few days, but during the 3 days of her stay, he did nothing. Moreover, without showing signs of the attention of a man who was interested in a woman. On the day she was supposed to leave, he didn't even get out of bed in the morning. Finally, at 11 a.m., Churchill found her, and they walked through an English park, reaching the Temple of Artemis. This was the best and last chance to propose, but again, he did nothing. As Clementine would later recall, she watched the beetle move as slowly as Churchill himself. "I thought if the bug crawled to the joint and Winston didn't make an offer, then he wasn't going to make one." It's worth saying that we have almost no information about Churchill's love affairs. He was not often seen in the company of women, and some sources are so bold as to suggest that at the age of 33, Winston has still not lost his virginity. We will not be so wordless, but this opinion of his contemporary has reached us. "I keep hearing that Winston can't be associated with any particular lady," wrote an acquaintance of Lloyd George. "The general opinion boils down to the fact that he is not a gentleman, and he looks at women rather unusually. Winston would be a million times more popular if it were allowed to be thought that he cared so much for one of the women that he was willing to risk a little comfort for her. Maybe it will come, but I doubt it." At the same time, historians identify up to 10 female names in his life. At 18, he mentioned the beautiful Polly Hackett, later the dancer Mabel Love, and the married woman Joyce Grenfell. He sympathizes with Ethel Barrymore, a representative of the famous acting dynasty, and is courting a certain Muriel Wilson, and they spend a whole week riding around France together. This is followed by an affair with Violet Asquith, with whom he broke off a few weeks before his wedding. But there's no need to talk about any long-term and serious relationship. Winston was always too busy. Let's better return to that day, to the Temple of Artemis. Churchill still got ahead of that bug and proposed to Clementine. The wedding was scheduled for September 12th. Clementine was 9 years younger than her chosen one. By that time, she had established a reputation as an extremely beautiful woman, serious, intelligent, educated, and at the same time sociable and charming. At the same time, Clementine came from an impoverished family, and her origins were somewhat uncertain. Her mother, Lady Blanche Hozier, had so many extramarital affairs that Clementine was not entirely sure who her father was. Clementine had previously been engaged 3 times, and although many newspapers celebrated her beauty, her rival, Violet Asquith, did not think highly of her prospects with Winston. His wife will never become more than a decorative sideboard for him, and, as I have often said, she is so undemanding that she will not want more. I don't know if he'll be able to endure the fact that she is as stupid as an owl, but for a while her life will become easier, because she will not have to sew clothes herself. And he, I believe, is a little in love. But it happened otherwise. In fact, Clementine was distinguished by a firm, independent character, had her own convictions. She belonged to the liberal camp and sympathized with the suffragettes. Clementine became her husband's loyal companion. They did not give her a large dowry, but Winston could always count on her help and discretion because his wife was much better at understanding people and situations. Clementine not only believed in her husband and endlessly talked with him about politics, she believed in him so passionately that she was ready to fight for him, sometimes physically. Once, a suffragist tried to push Winston under a train, to which Clementine jumped up to the woman and beat her with an umbrella. She took care of him, watched him, and enjoyed his great respect. This is evidenced by the courage that can be traced in her letters to her husband. At the moment when Churchill was on the verge of nervous breakdown on the eve of the Second World War, she was able to cool him down a little. "My dear Winston, I have to admit that I've noticed a deterioration in your behavior. You are no longer as kind as you used to be. Yes, it is you who must give the orders, and if they are not well carried out, you have the power to fire anyone and everyone, except the king, the Archbishop of Canterbury, and the Speaker. But you have to combine this terrible power with politeness, kindness, and, if possible, Olympic calm," she wrote to him. They rewarded each other with endearing nicknames, which they always signed their letters with. Clementine was Kitty, and Winston was either a pug or pig. And when Churchill opened the door in Chartwell, they often greeted each other with cute animal sounds, his ba-ba and her meow-meow. A year later, their daughter Diana was born. In total, the couple had 5 children, 1 boy and 4 girls, one of whom, Marigold, died of septicemia at the age of 2.5 years. At the same time, of course, Clementine paid quite a price to be Winston Churchill's wife. She once said that the following epitaph would be appropriate on her grave. "Here rests a woman who is eternally tired. She lived in a world that took a lot of effort." She admitted to her daughter Mary that she was deprived of the happiness of raising 4 children alone. Her whole life revolved around the man who was in first, second, and third place. Her husband was always too busy, and she felt abandoned. In 1908, due to the changes that took place in the British political arena, the gradual withdrawal of the luminaries of the Liberal Party into the background, and the coming to power of a new generation of energetic young people, Churchill received a significant but well-deserved promotion. He was appointed President of the Board of Trade and Home Secretary. So, at the age of 33, he managed to join the cabinet. From now on, Winston had to participate in discussions about the fate of society. It was a new experience for him. So far, he had remained aloof from the social problems of his country, and his lack of knowledge in this field was evident. Before that, he had never communicated directly with the people, and learned about poverty from the lower strata of society only from official reports and the results of social surveys. So, becoming president of the Board of Trade and Home Secretary, Churchill actively took up social reforms, implementing them with the same zeal and speed as all his ideas. So, Britain owes Churchill 3 achievements that belong to this period of his activity: approval of the Labor Exchanges Act, as well as the Law on the Chambers of Commerce in 1909. In addition, he offered an unemployment benefit for consideration, which was passed in 1911. In February 1910, Churchill once again changed his position because he was appointed Home Secretary. This title was then, along with Foreign Secretary and Chancellor of the Exchequer, one of the 3 most important positions in Britain. His area of competence included ensuring the safety of citizens, public order, as well as communication with Buckingham Palace, management of the London police, firefighters, management of the prison system. Acquittals and reduction of prison terms depended on the Home Secretary. It considered issues of immigration, agriculture, the condition of roads and canals, monitored the use of alcohol and prohibited substances, and the observance of moral standards. Such a huge field of activity opened opportunities for the 35-year-old ambitious Home Secretary to continue the policy of reforms. He dreamed of going down in history as a great politician who served the cause of progress. On the eve of his transition to Home Secretary, Churchill claimed, "I am one of those who believe that the world is constantly changing for the better." Do you also consider yourself an optimist like Churchill? Share with us in the comments. We want to find like-minded people. In fact, the new position hid many dangers. The labor movement became extremely active, and the speeches of the suffragettes took an increasingly serious turn. That is why Winston, becoming Home Secretary, had to combine a liberal policy with a policy of repression. And if at the beginning the first one prevailed, then gradually Churchill leaned more and more towards the second one. However, he began with the fact that, with his characteristic zeal, he undertook the implementation of a grandiose program of reforming the prison system. Winston sought to improve the conditions of prisoners' detention, ease their fate, and tried to help them rehabilitate in society. First of all, Churchill intended to abolish debt prison, as well as to change the conditions of punishment for juvenile offenders. Once, Churchill ordered the release of a 12-year-old boy who was sentenced to 7 years in a penal colony for stealing a piece of cod and sent him to his parents. This act of his made a lot of noise. Still, the Home Secretary failed to make a new summary of laws that would cover the entire criminal justice system. The same fate befell reform projects for the protection of shop workers who were mercilessly exploited by their owners. In the end, a decision was made to close shops half a day early, once a week. And yet the maintenance of order, a direct responsibility of the Home Office, increasingly occupied Winston, who was concerned about the unrest of workers and union members that broke out in 1910, as well as the aggressiveness of the feminist movement, which had grown significantly. Churchill himself repeatedly stated that he understood women's desire to get the right to vote. However, he did not undertake any obligations and rejected all bills offered to solve this issue. Meanwhile, in the summer of 1911, 2 state-scale strikes took place at once. First, port workers stopped work, and later, railway workers. Each time, Churchill called in the troops to subdue and force the strikers to retreat, and such measures were not without victims. In the end, when, through the efforts of Lloyd George, the government and the railway workers managed to reach an agreement and the conflict was settled, Churchill moved to the rank of enemies of the working class. At the end of September of the same year, Churchill went to Scotland, where he was invited by Asquith and offered to become the First Lord of the Admiralty. In fact, it was about a reshuffle within the cabinet. Reginald McKenna, a tough and strict man, was to replace Churchill as Home Secretary. By that time, Winston was already a mature politician and learned to use his talents and abilities wisely. A happy period came in his life, which coincided with the years of peaceful management of the Admiralty. Churchill settled in an elegant 18th-century mansion that housed the Admiralty, but he also spent a lot of time aboard the HMS Enchantress, which belonged to the Admiralty, and served Winston as both a floating office and a playroom. On it, he checked the bases and arsenals of the naval fleet, and in the summer, he made trips. When Winston found that the Admiralty had no battle plan in case of war, he decided to create a headquarters that would develop plans for operations at sea, as well as train future commanders. At the same time, Churchill radically reformed the membership of the Admiralty, replacing 3 of the 4 Sea Lords. He did not forget about ordinary sailors, raising their wages, introducing a day off on Sunday, canceling humiliating corporal punishment, and giving them the opportunity to advance up the career ladder to the rank of officer. In the field of promising technical innovations, Churchill's rich imagination and energy also came in handy. First, in 1913, he decided to switch ships from coal to fuel oil. The attempt was risky because England was a rich coal country, but oil was not mined on the islands at all. In June 1914, he convinced the House of Commons to authorize the government purchase of a 51% share in the profits of oil produced by the Anglo-Persian Oil Company to secure continued oil access for the Royal Navy. It also ensured free access to the Persian Gulf. Another merit of Churchill was the creation in 1912 of naval aviation on the basis of the naval wing of the Royal Flying Corps, which was later transformed into the Royal Naval Air Service. At this stage, Churchill was not only concerned with the improvement of airplanes and seaplanes, he also believed in the enormous potential of airships such as Zeppelins, although he later changed his opinion about them. In addition, 38-year-old Churchill set an example for others by mastering the art of piloting. He had about 40 flight hours. So in the matter of air navigation, Winston also turned out to be a pioneer, and yesterday's skeptics and opponents were forced to admit that he was right. Airplanes became his hobby for many years, and over time, he became obsessed with flying. Based on the fact that at that time aircraft construction was still very young and the aircraft of that time only remotely resembled modern ones, this was an example of courage or recklessness. Friends and relatives begged Churchill to leave this business, considering flights too dangerous. His cousin Sonny, Duke of Marlborough, said, "I don't think I shall be able to write you many more letters if you continue your travels in the air, and I seriously think that your duties to your wife, family, and friends should compel you to refrain from such a practice or pastime, whatever you call it, which involves so much danger to life. You're really wrong." His wife Clementine also did not share her husband's admiration and was extremely worried, and sometimes he went secretly without telling her anything. "Today I misbehaved and flew," he admitted on November 29, 1913, as if he had committed some childish prank. The fascination would expose him to mortal danger several times, but hot-headed and risky Winston continued to try his luck. In turn, luck did not always obey him. It must be said that the war caught Churchill by surprise, but his role in this bloody page of world history was and will remain ambiguous. It was one of the most difficult periods in his career, but it was also this period that shaped him as a politician who was not afraid of difficult decisions during wartime. On July 23rd, Austria-Hungary sent an ultimatum to Serbia, and the threat of armed confrontation in Europe turned out to be quite real. In the whirlwind of events that took a more serious turn every day, Churchill was not lost. His determination stood out clearly against the background of hesitation and doubts of most secretaries. Many of them formed something like a pacifist party and did not want to join the war. Unlike them, Winston convinced others of the need to take a hard line, although the further development of events made him increasingly apprehensive. In 1914, he was still relatively young, extremely energetic, and admitted that he relished the prospect of war. "I'm finished. I'm done. What I want above all things is to take some active part in beating the Germans. I'd go out to the front at once." Violet Asquith recalled his words. Of course, Churchill's word was not decisive when discussing the issue of Great Britain's entry into the armed conflict, but it was he who made the two key offers that were supported by the Prime Minister and then by the entire cabinet. First of all, on Tuesday, the 28th of July, the day Austria-Hungary declared war on Serbia, he offered to order the ships of the British fleet to secretly take up military positions at their bases off the coast of Scotland so that the German fleet would not catch them by surprise. The next day, the commanders-in-chief of the British fleet were ordered to take measures of heightened combat readiness, and on the night from Saturday, August 1st to Sunday, after it became known that Germany had declared war on Russia, Churchill offered to begin the general mobilization of the British fleet. As soon as the United Kingdom entered the war, the British quickly became disillusioned with their navy. There were two reasons for that. First, they were waiting for a grand naval battle, like Trafalgar, between the Grand Fleet and the German fleet, which would decide the outcome of the war. However, the Germans preferred to leave their ships at the bases, and no grand battle took place. Secondly, in the first weeks of military operations, the Grand Fleet suffered several setbacks in a row. The Admiralty focused mainly on surface ships and greatly underestimated the enemy's main forces, submarines and mines. And so, on September 22nd, 3 ships of the British fleet were sunk by 1 German submarine, and a month later another English battleship was blown up by a sea mine. So the First Lord of the Admiralty found himself in the position of the accused. Fortunately for the British Navy, and above all for Winston, at the turn of 1914 to 1915, military fortune shifted to the British camp. First, the Battle of the Falkland Islands took place in December, during which most of the German ships were sunk. Then, in January, already in the North Sea, the fight ended in favor of the British. At the same time, the blockade established from the first days of the war against Germany and the Allied countries began to have a noticeable effect on the food supply of the Central Empires. Then the British again believed in their navy, and accordingly, Churchill's trust credit increased. At that moment, Winston's asset was replenished with another successful undertaking. It was thanks to him that the first devices for decrypting documents appeared. In 1914, he became interested in the discovery of a new source of information which revolutionized the classic methods of espionage, decoding the coded messages of the enemy. Triple success helped the British to penetrate the secret of the German cipher. First, the Russian military handed over to the British Admiralty a copy of the German naval code intercepted in the Baltic Sea. Then, another code instruction was discovered in Australia, and finally part of the German cipher found its ways into the hands of sailors on a British fishing vessel. Churchill immediately created a special decryption service, which included the best specialists. They worked in the famous Room Number 40 in the Admiralty, which became the center of training for naval operations. Thanks to the information obtained in this way, the Admiralty was able to prevent the bombardment of the east coast of England by German cruisers and learn about the instructions received by the German fleet before the Battle of Dogger Blank. However, Churchill's biggest mistake at the time was the decision to prepare a naval expedition to bombard and then capture the Gallipoli Peninsula and then Constantinople to turn the tide of the war. The fleet faced the goal of entering the Bosphorus and the Dardanelles, thereby moving the situation on the French front from a standstill, and at the same time, not depriving the French of the support of British troops. It should be noted that the original idea did not belong to Churchill, and that the cabinet generally supported it. However, he was enthusiastic about this project and had an overly optimistic view of the prospects for its success. Churchill, burning with impatience, twice gave the order to bombard the Dardanelles. The Turks and their German advisors were alert and managed to take the necessary measures. Thus, the Allies could no longer catch the enemy by surprise. But Winston did not want to give up on his goal. On March 18, 1915, the British ships nevertheless began the operation and immediately came across a real minefield. The loss of personnel was terrible. Despite inhuman efforts, the Allies never advanced beyond their tiny bridgeheads on the southern tip of the peninsula. The command had to listen to the voice of reason, and on December 8, 1915, the Allied ships left the inhospitable strait. In general, the summary of the drama that unfolded in the Dardanelles was as follows. The losses of the Allies amounted to about 250,000 people killed, missing, wounded, and maimed. Among the reasons for such a tragedy, the number of troops was primarily insufficient. Churchill was given a much smaller force than he requested, bad weather, and the indecision of the fleet command. In May 1915, the brilliant First Lord fell from the political Olympus. Of course, he was to blame for the failure that befell the Allied forces in the Dardanelles, but the price he had to pay for it far exceeded his fault. The hour of revenge has struck for the Conservatives. From the moment the government turned to the Conservatives, Churchill was doomed, for the leaders of the party immediately announced to Asquith that the resignation and demotion of the First Lord of the Admiralty was an essential condition for their agreement to enter a coalition government. "I am the victim of a political intrigue," he lamented to a friend. "I am finished." The post of Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster, with which he was punished, completely deprived Churchill of the opportunity to participate in the management of state affairs, although he remained a member of the Dardanelles Committee and the former War Committee. For long months from May to October 1915, Churchill was in the grip of the worst depression of his life. After all, he turned out to be the only scapegoat in an unsuccessful operation. In addition, on November 11, 1915, Asquith decided to abolish the Dardanelles Committee and replace it with a 5-man military committee, which did not include Churchill. This new bitter humiliation was the last straw that filled the cup of his patience, and after 6 days, Churchill put on a military uniform again and went to fight on the Western Front. He joined the 2nd Grenadier Guards, then stationed at St. Omer. Immediately after his arrival, Winston was offered a brigade under his command. But since he needed to familiarize himself with the combat environment and gain frontline experience, it was decided for him to undergo training for a few weeks in the 2nd Grenadier Regiment, an elite guards unit. The colonel and officers of the regiment received Winston with hostility. However, little by little, his courage and steadfastness earned him the respect of his comrades, and they accepted Churchill into their circle with sincere joy. However, after the change of military leadership, Churchill had to change location again within 2 months. This time he was assigned to the Scottish Infantry Regiment in the rank of Lieutenant Colonel. The 6th Royal Scots Fusiliers came under Churchill's command. Winston gained authority from the first days of his stay in the battalion. The 100 days that Churchill spent in Flanders, commanding the Scots Fusiliers, markedly changed him. He never gave his environment a reason to feel his superiority. Day after day, he went around his site, checked the defensive structures, inspected the sandbags, because the German gunners did not sit idle. Once they destroyed the room that served as Winston's bedroom with a well-aimed shot. Meanwhile, a deep governmental crisis was inevitably looming over London. Then Winston became convinced that he must return to Westminster. A convenient opportunity presented itself to him in April. Then it was decided to reorganize the regiment of the Royal Scots Fusiliers, as a result of which the 6th Regiment was combined with another regiment, and Churchill lost his command post. He did not delay the decision. From now on, he was done with the front. On May 9, 1916, Churchill returned to London. But there he was still in disgrace. The only consolation for him in 1917 was the report of a special commission that investigated the reasons for the defeat in the Dardanelles. Winston had a faint hope of forgiveness. Let no one absolve the former First Lord of the blame for the disaster that claimed the lives of thousands of Englishmen, but at least now the blame was fairly distributed among all those responsible. The situation finally changed in July 1917, but Winston remained in disgrace until the end of the war and long after. Lloyd George offered Churchill the post of Minister of Munitions, which he happily accepted. There was outrage from the Conservative Party and threats to resign from several ministers at once, but Lloyd George stood the test. Although Winston performed his role competently and diligently, it did not have a significant impact on his political career. Beginning in 1915, this position did not have much importance after Lloyd George's solution to the shale crisis. In addition, Churchill had strained relations with the Prime Minister himself. The state of mind revealed in your letter is the reason why you do not win trust even where you command admiration. In every line of it, national interests are completely overshadowed by your personal concern. Despite this, Winston worked actively. Already in November 1917, he created a committee on demobilization and reconstruction within his department in order to outline long-term solutions for the post-war period in the social sphere. At the same time, gathering representatives of women's trade unions in his ministry, Churchill told them about his plans for the future organization of women's work. We are pioneers in the field of female employment in industry and even in military production. It is time to define the principles by which future generations will be guided by the use of women's labor in industry. Despite all the responsibilities and difficult tasks which Churchill did not lack in the Ministry of Munitions, he closely followed the course of military operations. Under various pretexts, he spent about a fifth of his time in France, either in Paris, or at headquarters, or at the front. Thanks to these frequent trips, he was lucky enough to witness the decisive stages of military operations. Thus, on August 8, 1918, Churchill, with a sense of deep satisfaction, was present at the Allied tank attack, which was finally crowned with success. The enemy front was broken through, and the long-awaited victory was just around the corner. Gallipoli haunted Churchill for decades. His political opponents did not miss the opportunity to reprimand him with the phrase, "Remember the Dardanelles," when he stood to speak before the House of Commons. But he did not lose his spirits. The Dardanelles might have saved millions of lives. Don't imagine I am running away from the Dardanelles. I glory in it, he responded. After the end of the war, Lloyd George offered Churchill the position of Secretary of State for War and Air in the new coalition government. However, this post, for all its significance, did not involve his participation in solving domestic political issues. For more than 2 years, Churchill combined the leadership of the Ministry of War and the Ministry of Aviation, which was entrusted to him additionally. And on February 13, 1921, Winston was assigned Secretary of State for the Colonies, but he remained Secretary of State for War and Air for another 2 months. Because of Churchill's brilliant handling of the munition problem in 1917 to 1918, his reputation was restored, and he once again became one of the main actors on the political scene. Winston remained as Secretary of State for the Colonies for 4 years, and during this time showed everything he was capable of. First, Churchill solved the problem of demobilization of soldiers who participated in the war using the principle 3 out of 4 soldiers return home, and the 4th gets double pay. Thus, 2,600,000 soldiers were hastily demobilized, and 900,000 remained in actual service. At the beginning of 1922, it became possible to cancel the mandatory conscription into the army, which was by no means popular with the people, and it returned to military service on a voluntary basis. After all, now the army could do without volunteers. So Churchill recorded the first resounding success in his new position. However, most of Winston's time and energy were taken up by 2 problems: Bolshevism in Russia and riots in Ireland. And because of this, he neglected his other duties. First of all, the defense suffered, which had to be reorganized immediately after the end of hostilities. The secretary neglected the opportunity to modernize the army based on the lessons of the war that had just ended and using new technologies. In addition, Churchill neglected aviation, even though he always showed great interest in it. Despite this, it was he who introduced the 10 years rule approved by the coalition of the government in August 1919, which related to the principles of developing a military budget and refusing to participate in military conflicts for 10 years. This rule led to unprecedented reductions in military spending. By the end of 1920, the Army's personnel was reduced to 370,000 men, while at the time of the signing of the armistice, there were 3 million troops in Britain. And the budget of British Middle Eastern aviation was reduced from 45 million to 11 million pounds. Meanwhile, tensions between the Irish and the United Kingdom were growing. Lloyd George, in the end, realized that the only possible solution in the current situation was to grant Ireland independence while dividing its territory. Churchill willingly supported the Prime Minister. The government decided to negotiate with the Irish nationalists and conclude a truce with them, which was signed in July. The result of the negotiations that took place in Downing Street was the agreement signed on December 6, 1921, which provided for the division of Ireland into 2 parts, independent and controlled by Britain. Churchill made the most significant contribution to its preparation. In all, Churchill served as Secretary of State for the colonies for 20 months. The total area of the entire territory of the British Empire reached its peak at that time. Unexpectedly, no one was ready for the changes that began in the British political world in the autumn of 1922. Lloyd George was removed from his post, the coalition government was dissolved, and Churchill was removed from power. He was also unable to take an active part in the unscheduled elections to the Legislative Assembly because he was then operated on due to an acute attack of appendicitis. However, this did not break Churchill. After some time, he jokingly summed up his failures. In the twinkling of an eye, I found myself without an office, without a seat, without a party, and without an appendix. Then Churchill decided to wait out the streak of failures. Having celebrated his 48th birthday on November 30th, he went to the south of France, where he spent 6 months painting and writing at the Golden Dream Villa in the beautiful surroundings of Cannes. For Winston, painting became a kind of way to distract from failures. He later described his first experience in a note. The next step after buying paints, an easel, a canvas, was to start. But how difficult it was to take this step. Beads of paint shone on the palette. The canvas rose in front of me, white and clean, but the empty brush hesitated in the air, burdened with fate. My hand seemed to be restrained by an unspoken prohibition. But in the end, the sky was definitely blue. So why doubt you need to take blue paint, mix it with white, and apply it to the upper part of the canvas? It doesn't take an art education to see that. Such a starting point is suitable for everyone. In this passage, we see with what determination he takes on new things. Of course, his paintings, and during his lifetime, he painted more than 500, do not differ in technical accuracy and academic correctness. But they've earned many admirers, primarily for their boldness, brightness, richness of color, and the enthusiasm they radiate. And maybe he would have ended his political career by resting and painting in his spare time, but life gave him a second chance. In the fall of 1923, during the economic collapse, Prime Minister Baldwin decided to put the question of a return to protectionism to a national vote. This could not leave Churchill indifferent, and he again found himself in the political arena as a defender of free trade. He was offered to run for the Leicester West constituency as a representative of the liberal free traders. Churchill took up the election campaign with great diligence, but his efforts were not successful. Churchill lost the election, but returned to the Society of Statesmen as a full member, and very soon he refused to cooperate with the Liberals, not agreeing with their views. Churchill tried his luck for the third time in March 1924 in the by-elections as an independent candidate, an opponent of socialism. After a short but colorful and highly publicized election campaign, Winston was defeated, although his opponent won by a narrow margin of only 43 votes. It was a great disappointment for Churchill, especially since he lost the election for the third time in a row, although he believed that victory was in his pocket. However, very soon fate smiled at him again. In the summer of 1924, the Conservative Party of Epping, a wealthy London suburb, entered into a secret agreement with him and offered to run for their constituency in the upcoming election. As a result, he not only won the election, but also took the offered post of Chancellor of the Exchequer, a post once held by his father. However, the Chancellor of the Exchequer still held a strong position in the government and parliament. The state budgets presented by him until 1929 were technically competent and politically well argued, invariably received favorable evaluations, although they did not help to reduce the unemployment rate. At the next election, Labour won the majority of seats in Parliament, and Churchill, at the age of 54, lost his position again and was removed from power for 10 years. His biographers called this period the Wilderness Years, in which Winston mainly dictated to his secretaries the material for his history books about his family and the era in which he lived. From 1929 to 1939, Churchill dictated thousands of pages in this way. By the end of 1938, he was 64 years old. He was alone in the Tory party, and he had never felt this more acutely than then. He was removed from power 10 years ago. It seemed that Churchill's career could be put to an end. However, the events of 1939 changed everything. In mid-March, German troops occupied Prague. The Munich Agreement turned into an empty and useless piece of paper. Since then, everything has changed. The events that followed confirmed the words of the irrepressible prophet. No one listened to Churchill, and meanwhile, his prophecies were coming true before everyone's eyes. People understood that the temporary peace was only the eve of war because a new crisis was already ready to explode on the Polish border. In short, Churchill managed to restore his reputation. However, despite the fact that his popularity was growing, and at the beginning of the summer a whole campaign was launched in the press, made with the aim of returning Churchill to the government, nothing was decided yet. This was evidenced by a public opinion poll, according to which only 7% of citizens wanted to see him as prime minister. But since Churchill was removed from power a long time ago, now it turned out to be in his hands because he was not responsible for all the failures that happened in his absence, and Churchill's star shone again for future achievements. War is terrible, but slavery is worse. As soon as the United Kingdom declared war on Germany at 11 o'clock in the morning on September 3, 1939, on the same day Chamberlain, convinced that it was necessary to return Churchill to the government, offered him the position of First Lord of the Admiralty, as well as the right to vote in his war cabinet, the news of Churchill's appointment as First Lord was received with joy by the fleet. As First Lord, Churchill was one of the most important ministers during the so-called Phoney War, when British forces fought only at sea. He was full of enthusiasm after the Battle of the River Plate and later welcomed the ship's crews back home. These were brilliant sea battles, he declared. In a dark, cold winter, they warmed the hearts of the British. On February 16, 1940, Churchill personally ordered the captain of the HMS Cossack, Philip Vian, to board the German tanker Altmark in Norwegian waters and free about 300 British people who had been captured by Admiral Graf Spee. These actions, as well as the First Lord's speeches, greatly enhanced his authority. At the same time, Churchill was concerned about the activities of the German Navy in the Baltic Sea and initially wanted to send the British Navy there. But soon a plan was adopted which consisted in mining Norwegian waters and stopping the supply of iron ore from Narvik to Germany. Due to disagreements about mines, both in the War Cabinet itself and with the French government, this operation was delayed until April 8, 1940. That is, the day before the German attack on Norway. After the Allies failed to prevent the German occupation of Norway, an open debate took place in the House of Commons on the government's conduct of the war from 7 to the 9th of May. They are considered one of the most important events in the history of the Parliament. The next day, the Labour opposition called for a roll call vote, effectively a vote of no confidence in the Chamberlain government. Everyone wanted to see Churchill as Prime Minister. Why? The fact was that Churchill became a figure who personified the party of a determined war with Hitler. Even in the 1930s, he constantly emphasized that Germany was a threat to European peace and had to be opposed. He was able to make sure of this during a trip to Germany with his son Randolph in 1932. Winston was interested in the Battle of Blenheim. His son, also a journalist, was interested in the Nazis. It was Randolph who introduced his father to Hitler's confidant, who almost brought two prominent representatives of that time to the same dinner table. Churchill wrote about that period. At that time, I had no national prejudice against Hitler. I knew little of his doctrine or biography, and nothing of his character. The meeting did not go well, and it's interesting that Hitler never came to it. The reason, as historians call it, was Winston's active interest in the Semitic question and unambiguous rhetoric regarding Hitler's anti-Semitic appeals. In a conversation with the mediator, Churchill, with sincere liberalism, asked, "Why does your leader call for violence against Jews? What is the point of being an adversary of a man just because of his birth? Can someone influence their birth?" Gradually, Winston began to understand, to feel the evil at the heart of German ideology. He increasingly opposed Hitler's brutal treatment of national minorities. In the same 1932, Churchill spoke before the parliament stating that the sturdy, Teutonic youths marching in squads through the streets and roads of Germany, with the light of desire in their eyes to suffer for their fatherland, do not aspire to a position in society at all. They want weapons. And when they had weapons, Churchill predicted, they would use them to regain lost territories. Although such a position was very unpopular at that time in British society, Winston was initially called a panic monger and warmonger, but Hitler did not stop in his demands and went further. Then the British realized that he had to be repelled, and when Chamberlain's government came under criticism for the defeat of the British and French in Norway, Churchill became the best candidate for the post of Prime Minister. Churchill had the support of both sides of the House, but as a member of the government, he had to speak on its behalf, so he had to defend the government's actions at the risk of damaging his own prestige. The government won the vote, but its majority was drastically reduced. In the early hours of May 10th, German troops invaded Belgium, Luxembourg, and the Netherlands, which became a prelude to the attack on France. Since the roll call, Chamberlain had been trying to form a coalition government. On Friday afternoon, Labour said it was ready to enter it, but only if it was led by another Conservative. The only candidates were Churchill and Foreign Secretary Lord Halifax. Halifax recognized that his membership in the House of Lords would prevent him from running the government effectively, so Chamberlain advised the king to appoint Churchill to the position. Later, Churchill wrote of a feeling of deep relief because now he had everything that was happening in his hands. He believed that he was walking hand in hand with fate and that all his previous life was preparation for this hour and for these tests. His first speech as Prime Minister, delivered on May 13th in the House of Commons, was called Blood, Toil, Tears, and Sweat. It was only a short statement, but according to Jenkins, it contained phrases that echoed for decades. Churchill clearly explained to the people that there was a long, thorny road ahead and that the ultimate goal was victory. I would say to the House that I have nothing to offer but blood, toil, tears, and sweat. We have before us an ordeal of the most grievous kind. You ask, what is our aim? I can answer in one word. It is victory. Victory at all costs. Victory in spite of all terror. Victory, however long and hard the road may be, for without victory, there is no survival. Churchill created a small war cabinet from the leaders of the main parties. His government was a coalition. He worked with both the Labour Party and the Liberal Party. Extremely energetic, he was the engine of the British government and condemned anyone who worked slower than they should, and that was exactly what Britain needed at that time. During the war, the cabinet varied in size and membership. In response to earlier criticism that there was no clearly defined single minister responsible for the war affairs, Churchill created and held the additional position of Minister of Defense himself, becoming the most powerful wartime prime minister in British history. He brought outside experts into the government to carry out vital tasks, especially in the domestic arena. Among them were personal friends such as Lord Beaverbrook and Frederick Lindemann, who became a scientific advisor to the government. The circumstances that arose when he became prime minister were extremely difficult for Britain. Germany quickly surrounded the best forces of the Allies, pressed them to the sea, forced the Dutch and Belgian armies to surrender. The command of the British fleet saw an opportunity to evacuate at least part of the British forces. About 350,000 British and French were surrounded there. At a difficult time for Britain and the Allies, when defeat seemed imminent, Halifax suggested that the government consider a negotiated peace settlement, mediated by the still neutral Mussolini. From May 26th to 28th, there were even several meetings at the highest level, including two with French Premier Paul Renaud. Churchill himself considered an armistice, but ultimately concluded that Hitler would not agree to Britain retaining its navy and army, and therefore the terms would be unacceptable. Churchill said that by resisting the Germans, the British would be in no worse conditions than if they went to peace. Churchill's decision was to fight on even if France capitulated, but without Chamberlain's support, his position remained precarious. Churchill had the full support of both Labour members, but knew that he would not retain the position of Prime Minister if both Chamberlain and Halifax were against him. Finally, having secured the support of the outer cabinet, Churchill bypassed Halifax and convinced Chamberlain. He believed that the only option was to fight on. I am convinced that every single one of you will rise up and tear me from my seat if I even think for a moment about negotiating or surrendering. If this Long Island story of ours is to end at last, let it end only when each of us lies choking in his own blood upon the ground. With his oratory skills, he strengthened public opinion against a peaceful settlement and prepared the British people for a long war. According to Jenkins, Churchill's speeches were an inspiration to the nation and a catharsis to Churchill himself. Operation Dynamo, the evacuation of 338,226 British and French soldiers from Dunkirk, ended on Tuesday, June 4th, the same day that the French rear guard surrendered. The number of survivors far exceeded expectations, and this gave rise to the general opinion that Dunkirk was a miracle and even a victory. Churchill the same day had to remind his compatriots that wars were not won by evacuations.
We shall go on to the end. We shall fight in France. We shall fight on the seas and oceans. We shall fight with growing confidence and growing strength in the air. We shall defend our island, whatever the cost may be. We shall fight on the beaches. We shall fight on the landing grounds. We shall fight in the fields and in the streets. We shall fight in the hills. We shall never surrender!
The army was saved, but virtually all machinery was lost, so Britain had an army with a minimum of weapons. It was necessary to enlist the support of the states and their weapons, but their leadership did not believe that Great Britain would stand to the end and was in no hurry to intervene in the course of the war. The next day, Germany began implementing fall rot, and on June 10th, Italy entered the war. Already on June 25th, the Wehrmacht completed the conquest of France. Hitler's attack on Great Britain and a possible invasion seemed inevitable. Faced with this threat, Churchill addressed the House of Commons on June 18th and delivered one of his most famous speeches, ending with, "What General Weygand called the Battle of France is over. I expect that the Battle of Britain is about to begin. Hitler knows that he will have to break us in this island or lose the war. Let us therefore brace ourselves to our duty and so bear ourselves that if the British Commonwealth and Empire lasts for 1,000 years, men will say, this was their finest hour." Among Churchill's initiatives in June and July 1940 were orders to establish Special Operations Executive (SOE) and British commandos. The SOE was ordered to carry out sabotage activities in Nazi-occupied Europe, while the task of the commandos was to attack military objects there. Hugh Dalton became the head of the SOE, who wrote down Churchill's words in his diary, "And now go and set Europe ablaze." The Prime Minister was confident that given the increase in production, Great Britain would be able to hold out, but did not hold out much hope of winning the war without American intervention. He had to show the states that Britain would stand to the last. He understood that they would be able to hold, unless there was a successful German landing. So they had to ensure that the French fleet did not fall into the hands of the Germans after the surrender of France. Therefore, all French warships in British ports were interned. The British Mediterranean fleet approached the main base of the French in Algeria to neutralize the fleet there. The French admiral refused options for resolving the issue. Then, the British ships fired on the French fleet. 1,500 French soldiers died, and several ships of the line were sunk. Only one battleship and several smaller ones escaped and reached the French Toulon. All of France was engulfed in outrage. The Nazi propaganda machine hardly needed to incite hatred. Everywhere there were posters of a French sailor drowning in a fiery hell, or of the British leader appearing as a bloodthirsty Moloch. This page is still heavy in the Anglo-French debate. Churchill recalled that he felt great shame for his act. When he came to the House of Commons the next day, he expected to be attacked from all sides. After all, he ordered the use of the most modern combat weapon against essentially defenseless targets. He ordered open fire by sailors with whom Britain was not at war. Sincerely loving France, it was a difficult step for him. The choice was terrible. It was like taking the life of one's own child for the sake of saving the state. He would remember. Hunched over, pale, he awaited condemnation, but he was met with applause. It demonstrated to the world that Britain would do anything, even attack its own allies, for its own safety. In this way, Churchill showed the determination of the British government, and perhaps it was a move that convinced the American President Roosevelt that Britain would resist. Then in the House of Commons, everyone congratulated him and clapped him on the shoulder. From the point of view of cold logic, he made a strategically correct move. Did he feel the same way? Winston sat with his chin in his hands, tears streaming down his cheeks. In September 1940, the British and American governments concluded a Destroyers for Bases agreement, according to which the Royal Navy received 50 American destroyers in exchange for the right of the United States to place its bases in Bermuda, the Caribbean, and Newfoundland. An additional advantage of Great Britain was that it had the right to redeploy military property on these bases to another place. Churchill's good relationship with U.S. President Franklin Delano Roosevelt helped ensure the supply of vital food, oil, and munitions via the North Atlantic shipping lanes. It was for this reason that Churchill breathed a sigh of relief when Roosevelt was re-elected in the 1940 election. On June 22, 1941, Hitler attacked the Soviet Union. And although Churchill knew in April that an attack was imminent and tried to warn Joseph Stalin through the British ambassador in Moscow, but in vain. Stalin did not trust Churchill, and it was in vain. In August of the same year, Churchill, for the first time during the war, crossed the Atlantic aboard the Prince of Wales and met with Roosevelt. At the same time, they concluded an agreement, later known as the Atlantic Charter. It outlined the view of both countries on the future of the world. It's believed to prompt the signing of the Declaration of the United Nations in 1942, which became the basis for the United Nations organization created in 1945. On December 7th through the 8th, 1941, Japan attacked Pearl Harbor and Malaya. And on the 8th, Churchill declared war on Japan. 3 days later, Germany and Italy jointly declared war on the United States. Later that month, Churchill traveled to Washington to meet with Roosevelt at the First Washington Conference. Even when Churchill was halfway across the Atlantic, Roosevelt decided that first of all it was necessary to win in Europe, and only then in the Pacific Ocean. The Americans agreed with Churchill that the main enemy was Hitler, and that the defeat of Germany was the key to the success of the Allies. It was also decided that the first military strike that the British and Americans would do together would be an attack on Algeria and Morocco. On December 26th, Churchill addressed both houses of the U.S. Congress. That night, he suffered a mild heart attack. His personal physician, Charles Wilson, advised him not to overexert himself for a period of time. Despite his health issues, 2 days later, Churchill traveled by train to Ottawa, where he spoke in the Canadian Parliament. In mid-January, he returned home and offered to put on the agenda of the House of Commons the issue of a vote of confidence in the government. The chamber almost unanimously voted for the government. In addition to successes, in particular in the Battle of the Atlantic, there was also unpleasant news. The Japanese were advancing in all directions, especially at sea and in Malaya. At a press conference in Washington, Churchill had to downplay growing doubts about Singapore's security. After defeats in Norway, France, Greece, and Crete, the Prime Minister strongly doubted the fighting strength of British soldiers. When the Japanese captured Singapore on February 15th, he felt his doubts were confirmed and said, "This is the worst disaster and largest capitulation in British military history." On the 11th of February, the Kriegsmarine pulled off its audacious Channel Dash, a massive blow to British naval prestige. The combined effect of these events was to sink Churchill's morale to its lowest point of the war. Meanwhile, by the end of April 1942, the Japanese occupied most of Burma. The counterattack was hampered by the monsoon season, disordered conditions in Bengal and Bihar, and a severe cyclone that devastated the region in October 1942. Due to Japanese restrictions on rice imports from Burma and a series of large-scale natural disasters such as floods and crop diseases, the Bengal famine of 1943 killed an estimated 3 million people. On 20th of May 1942, the Soviet Foreign Affairs Minister Vyacheslav Molotov arrived in London to sign a treaty of friendship. Molotov wanted it done on the basis of certain territorial concessions regarding Poland and the Baltic countries. Churchill and Eden worked for a compromise, and eventually a 20-year treaty was formalized, but with the question of frontiers placed on hold. Molotov was also seeking a second front in Europe. Churchill confirmed that preparations were in progress and made no promises on a date. Churchill was pleased with these negotiations. However, Rommel had launched his counteroffensive, Operation Venice, to begin the Battle of Gazala on 26 of May. The Allies were ultimately driven out of Libya and suffered a major defeat in the fall of Tobruk on the 21st of June. Churchill was with Roosevelt when the news of Tobruk reached him. He was shocked by the surrender of 35,000 troops, which was, apart from Singapore, the heaviest blow he received in the war. The Axis advance was eventually halted at the First Battle of El Alamein in July and the Battle of Alam el Hafa in early September. Both sides were exhausted and in urgent need of reinforcements and supplies. During the Washington Conference in June, Churchill and Roosevelt agreed on the implementation of the Operation Torch, which aimed to land the Allies in French North Africa, Morocco, and Algeria. The Prime Minister returned to Britain on June 25th and faced another attempt at a vote of no confidence, this time on the issue of general leadership of military operations, and again he won the vote by a large margin. Despite health problems, in August, Churchill visited British troops in North Africa to inspire the soldiers. From there, he went to Moscow for his first meeting with Stalin. Despite the understanding of the two leaders on a personal level, there were no significant agreements, given the course of the war, because the Germans were still advancing on all fronts. Stalin desperately asked for the opening of the Second Front in Europe, which Molotov had already discussed with Churchill in May, but received the same negative response. At the end of 1942, a fundamental breakthrough in the course of the war took place. The Allies won the key battles for El Alamein and Stalingrad. Until November, the Allies always defended. From November, the Germans did. Churchill ordering the ringing of church bells across Great Britain for the first time since the early 1940s. Celebrating the Allied victory of El Alamein, he delivered one of his most memorable military speeches. This is not the end. It is not even the beginning of the end. But it is, perhaps, the end of the beginning. In January 1943, Churchill, together with Roosevelt and General Charles de Gaulle, on behalf of Free French forces, signed the so-called Casablanca Declaration, where they pledged to fight until the unconditional surrender by the Axis powers. After Morocco, Churchill traveled to Cairo, Aden, Cyprus, and Algeria, staying abroad for almost a month. On February 11th, he appealed to the House of Commons. The next day, he fell seriously ill with pneumonia. Treatment and further recovery lasted more than a month. The most important conference of the year was held from November 28th to December 1st in Tehran. It was the first meeting of the Big Three. Roosevelt and Stalin jointly convinced Churchill to open a second front in Western Europe, and it was also agreed that after the war, Germany would be divided, but without any clear decisions as to how. At that time, Churchill was traveling more and more, and he was getting sick more and more. In mid-May 1944, the resistance of the opponents in Italy was finally broken, which allowed the Allies to finally advance to Rome, which was taken on June 4th. But it cost them a lot. Difficulties in Italy forced Churchill to radically change his views on the future strategy of the Allies. And so, returning from North Africa to England, he plunged into the planning of Operation Overlord, a joint Anglo-American operation holding weekly meetings with the leadership of the Allied forces and the British Chiefs of Staff, over which he presided. Churchill was very enthusiastic about the project of artificial harbors Mulberry, and also sought to make the most of the air power of the Allies, which at the beginning of 1944 had become insurmountable. Churchill was determined to take an active part in the invasion of Normandy and hoped to cross the Channel on D-Day, June 6, 1944, or at least the day after. The Prime Minister had expected the Allied death toll on D-Day to reach 20,000, but his forecast turned out to be too pessimistic, with fewer than 8,000 deaths for the whole of June. From October 9th to 19th, 1944, the Fourth Moscow Conference was held, at which Churchill and Eden met with Stalin and Molotov. This conference became infamous because of the so-called Percentages Agreement, in which Churchill and Stalin effectively agreed on the post-war fate of the Balkans. At that time, Soviet troops were in Romania and Bulgaria. Churchill offered a scale of dominance across the region to, as he put it, get at cross purposes in small ways. He wrote down on a piece of paper the possible percentages of mutual influence on the country and gave it to Stalin, who ticked it. According to the agreement, Russia was supposed to influence Romania by 90% and Bulgaria by 75%. Great Britain and the USA were supposed to have 90% influence on Greece. The influence on Hungary and Yugoslavia was to be shared equally. In 1958, 5 years after Churchill published an account of this meeting in the book The Second World War, the Soviet authorities denied Stalin's consent to such an imperialist proposal. But the meeting of the Big Three in Yalta had a significant impact on the fate of the post-war world. The main issues were two things: about the creation of the United Nations after the war, and the more contentious question of Poland's post-war status, which Churchill saw as a precedent for the future of Eastern Europe. He was sharply criticized for the part of the Yalta Agreement that dealt with Poland. For example, 27 Tory MPs voted against him when the issue was debated in the House of Commons at the end of the month. However, Jenkins assures that Churchill did everything in his power, given the very difficult circumstances, because Roosevelt was seriously ill and could not significantly support him. Another consequence of the Yalta Conference was the so-called Operation Keel Haul. The Western Allies agreed to the forced repatriation of all Soviet citizens, including prisoners of war, from the Allied occupation zones to the Soviet Union. Later, this policy was extended to all Eastern European refugees, among whom there were many anti-communists. On the night of February 14th through 15th, 1945, approximately 1,200 British and American bombers struck the German city of Dresden. which was overflowing with wounded and refugees from the Eastern Front. This happened as part of the bombing of the area, which Churchill initiated in January to bring the end of the war closer. He regretted the bombing, because the first reports indicated an excessive number of victims among the civilian population, as for the end of the war. On March 28th, he decided to limit the area bombing and sent a memorandum to General Ismay for the Chiefs of Staff Committee. The destruction of Dresden remains a serious query against the conduct of Allied bombing. I feel the need for more precise concentration upon military objectives, rather than on mere acts of terror and wanton destruction, however impressive. On May 7, 1945, at the Supreme Headquarters, Allied Expeditionary Force in Reims, the Allies accepted the surrender of Germany. May 8th was Victory in Europe Day, or VE Day, which was announced to compatriots on the radio by the Prime Minister himself.
Yesterday morning at 2:41 a.m. at General Eisenhower's headquarters, General Jodl, the representative of the German High Command, and of Grand Admiral Dönitz, the designated head of the German state, signed the act of unconditional surrender of all German land, sea, and air forces in Europe to the Allied Expeditionary Forces and simultaneously to the Soviet High Command. Hostilities will end officially at 1 minute after midnight tonight, Tuesday, the 8th of May.
Then, Churchill went to Buckingham Palace, where he and the royal family appeared on the balcony in front of a huge crowd of celebrants. From there, he proceeded to Whitehall Street, where he addressed another large crowd. God bless you all. This is your victory. In our long history, we have never seen a greater day than this. Man or woman, everyone has done their best. At that moment, he asked Ernest Bevan to say a few words so that he too could share in the applause, to which Bevan replied, "No, Winston, this is your day," and proceeded to conduct the crowd, singing "For He's a Jolly Good Fellow." In the evening, Churchill once again addressed the people on the radio, assuring that victory over Japan would come in the coming months, and indeed the Japanese surrendered a few months later on August 15, 1945. Before we continue talking about the post-war period and Churchill's last years, we would like to ask you to like this video. And if you like to study history with us in an interactive way and learn about the biographies of legendary personalities of all times, subscribe to our channel and click on the bell so you don't miss new videos. Well, are you ready? Then let's continue. Almost 10 years have passed since the last general election in 1935. Labor ministers did not want to remain part of the cross-party coalition wartime government. On May 23, 1945, Churchill resigned as prime minister. Later that day, the king asked him to form a new government. It included conservatives, national liberals, and a few non-factional figures, but no labor or official liberals. Churchill did not stop serving as prime minister. In particular, he exchanged messages with the U.S. administration regarding the upcoming Potsdam Conference, but he was officially reassigned only on May 28th. On July 17th, Churchill represented Great Britain at the post-war Potsdam Conference. He attended 9 sessions in 9 days and then returned to England to count the election results. Labour won a convincing victory, so Attlee returned as the new prime minister and Bevan as the new foreign secretary for the last 5 days of the conference. Potsdam turned out to be unsuccessful for Churchill. According to Eden, his performance was appalling, and he himself was unprepared and verbose. Churchill upset the Chinese, irritated the Americans, and easily gave in to Stalin, whom he was supposed to resist. Churchill mismanaged the election campaign, resorting to narrow party politics and trying to smear Labour. On the 4th of June, he made a major political gaffe, declaring in a radio broadcast that a Labour government would have to resort some form of Gestapo to secure its agenda. As a result, the main parties in Woodford did not oppose Churchill, but his lead over the only independent candidate, Clement Attlee, turned out to be much smaller than expected. That day, Churchill's doctor, Lord Morn, spoke to him about the ingratitude of the British, to which Churchill replied, "I wouldn't call it that. They have had a very hard time." Despite Churchill's great personal support, the Conservatives lost the election. That evening, without waiting for the meeting of the Parliament, he resigned from the Prime Minister position. He was succeeded by Attlee, who formed the first Labour government. There were many reasons for Churchill's defeat. One of the main ones was the people's need for post-war reform. In addition, they did not see the military leader as a person who would lead them in peacetime. Churchill continued to lead the Conservative Party and was the leader of the opposition for 6 years. In 1946, he stayed in America for almost 3 months, from the beginning of January to the end of March. It was during this trip that he delivered the Iron Curtain speech about the USSR and the Eastern Bloc it created in the presence of President Truman. Churchill stated, "From Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic, an iron curtain has descended across the continent. Behind that line lie all the capitals of the ancient states of Central and Eastern Europe: Warsaw, Berlin, Prague, Vienna, Budapest, Belgrade, Bucharest, and Sofia. All these famous cities and the populations around them lie in what I must call the Soviet sphere." He meant that. Although the Soviet Union did not want war with its Western allies, its outposts in Eastern Europe made it impossible for the three great powers to create a triangular leadership of the world. Churchill wanted much closer cooperation between Great Britain and America. In the same speech, he called for a special relationship between the British Commonwealth and Empire and the United States, but emphasized the need for cooperation within the framework of the UN Charter. Churchill feared a global nuclear war and firmly believed that in order to preserve peace and freedom, friendship and cooperation between Great Britain and America must be built on a solid foundation. He had a good relationship with Truman, but was skeptical of his idea of creating the European Defense Community, EDC, through which Truman hoped to reduce America's military presence in West Germany. Churchill wanted the American army to defend British interests in Egypt and the Middle East. Instead, Truman expected Britain to use the military in the Korean War. Americans saw the final decline of the British Empire, so they welcomed the policy of decolonization. However, Churchill, who had always been an imperialist, believed that the future place of Great Britain among world powers depended on whether it remained an empire. Churchill was an early supporter of pan-Europeanism, that is, the integration of European countries on a federal basis. As early as 1930, he called for the establishment of a United States of Europe. In 1949, he supported the creation of the Council of Europe, and in 1951, the European Coal and Steel Community. However, expressing such opinions, he always clearly warned against joining Great Britain to any federal entity. In the 1950s general election, Labour won again, but by a much smaller margin. Churchill remained the leader of the opposition, but a year later, the Conservatives won. Churchill again became Prime Minister at the age of almost 77 years.
We are the chosen few. All of you will be damned. There is no place in heaven for you. We can't have heaven crammed. I thought it was a muting quotation that I read this morning.
At that time, his health was very weak. He had a few minor strokes. He was treated for heart failure, eczema, and deafness. By December, King George VI was already very worried about Churchill's performance and was about to ask him to resign and appoint Eden as his successor. But the king himself was seriously ill and died on February 6th, not having time to carry out his intention. At that time, Churchill made friends with Elizabeth II. It was from her that he received the Order of the Garter and became Sir Winston.
Sir Winston Churchill, who in his time has helped shape the destinies of the Queen's people, joins the honored company of the Sovereign's Knights. It is perhaps his finest hour.
Everyone already thought that after the coronation of Elizabeth II in May 1953, Churchill would retire. But it was then that Eden fell seriously ill. Therefore, Churchill also took on the duties of the Foreign Secretary. Eden was incapacitated for the rest of the year and never fully recovered. On the evening of June 23, 1953, Churchill suffered a major stroke and became partially paralyzed down one side. Had Eden been healthy, it would most likely have ended Churchill's premiership. This was kept a secret, and by November he had fully recovered. In the same year, Churchill was awarded the Nobel Prize in Literature for his mastery in historical and biographical description, as well as for brilliant oratory in defending exalted human values. It's interesting that two nominations were presented to the Nobel Committee that year, Winston Churchill himself and Ernest Hemingway. Preference was given to the British politician, and Hemingway's enormous contribution to literature was recognized a year later. Due to the deterioration of Churchill's health, the award was presented to his wife.
But here it is the author who gives luster to the prize. I ask you now to accept on behalf of your husband the 1953 Nobel Prize for Literature from the hand of His Majesty the King.
In October 1954, Winston Churchill's 80th birthday was celebrated with a gala banquet at Buckingham Palace. Less than a year had passed since this pleasant event, and on April 5, 1955, Churchill resigned from the post of Prime Minister of Great Britain due to age and health. The former Prime Minister was again offered the peerage, the first time this happened back in 1945, and as a possible title was considered Duke of London, in honor of the country's capital, which is unprecedented in the history of Persian titles. In addition, it would be the only since 1874 conferment of the ducal title on a non-royal. Churchill abdicated the title because in case of acceptance, his death would have ended the already not very successful political career of his only son Randolph, who, according to the laws of the time, would have automatically inherited the title and could not continue run for the House of Commons, of which he was a member in 1940 to 1945. After leaving the premiership, Churchill remained an MP until he refused to stand as a candidate in the 1964 general election. With the exception of 1922 to 1924, he was a deputy from October 1900 and represented 5 constituencies. However, even before the 1959 general election, he rarely visited the House of Commons. Despite the convincing victory of the Conservatives in the 1959 elections, he won 1,000 votes less in Woodford than the previous time. He spent most of his retirement at Chartwell or at his London home in Hyde Park Gate, and was a regular in the high world at La Pausa Villa on the French Riviera. In June 1962 in Monte Carlo, 87-year-old Churchill fell and broke his hip. He was taken home to a London hospital where he stayed for 3 weeks. According to Jenkins, after that misfortune, Churchill was never the same, and his last 2 years passed as if in twilight. In 1963, U.S. President John Kennedy, on the basis of a special act of Congress, declared him an honorary citizen of the USA. Churchill was physically unable to attend the ceremony at the White House, so his son and grandson accepted the award for him. On January 12, 1965, Churchill had his last stroke. He died almost 2 weeks later on the 24th, the 70th anniversary of his father's death. The plan for his burial, codenamed Operation Hope Not, had been developed without publicity in advance for years. Queen Elizabeth II and the services of Buckingham Palace took the funeral organization into their own hands and gave orders, coordinating their actions with Downing Street and consulting with the Churchill family. It was decided to organize a state funeral. This honor in the entire history of Great Britain was awarded to only 10 outstanding people who were not members of the royal family before Churchill. Among them were the physicist Isaac Newton, Admiral Nelson, the Duke of Wellington, and the politician Gladstone. For a long time, Churchill's funeral became the largest state funeral in the history of Great Britain. Within 3 days, access to the coffin with the body of the deceased installed in Westminster Hall, the oldest part of the English Parliament building, was opened. On January 30th at 9:30 a.m., the funeral ceremony began. The coffin, covered with the national flag, was placed on a carriage, the same carriage on which the body of Queen Victoria was carried in 1901. It was carried by 142 sailors and 8 officers of the naval forces of Great Britain. The coffin was followed by members of the deceased's family, Lady Churchill, children Randolph, Sarah, Mary, and her husband Christopher Soames, grandchildren. Following the family with a huge drum in front were the cavalry, the horse guards in parade uniforms, musicians of the artillery band in red kilts, representatives of the British Navy, a delegation from the London Police. The procession participants walked very slowly, taking no more than 65 steps per minute. The British Air Force Band, which led the procession, played Symphony No. 5 by Beethoven. 7,000 soldiers and 8,000 policemen maintained order along the way of the procession. The funeral procession, reaching 1.5 kilometers in length, passed through the entire historical part of London, first from Westminster to Whitehall, then from Trafalgar Square to St. Paul's Cathedral. At 9:45 a.m., when the funeral procession reached Whitehall, Big Ben struck for the last time and fell silent until midnight. 90 cannon volleys were fired at 1-minute intervals in St. James Park, one for each year of the deceased's life. Through Trafalgar Square, the Strand, and Fleet Street, the funeral procession made its way to St. Paul's Cathedral, where a memorial service was held. Queen Elizabeth II and the entire royal family, as well as the first persons of the kingdom, arrived at the cathedral. Representatives of 112 countries arrived at the ceremony. Many countries were represented by heads of state and government. The funeral was broadcast by many television companies, with 350 million people in Europe watching the broadcast, including 25 million in Great Britain. Only Irish television did not broadcast live. In accordance with the politician's wishes, he was buried in the family burial of the Spencer Churchill family in the cemetery of St. Martin's Church in Bladon, near Blenheim Palace, the place of his birth. The coffin containing the body was lowered onto a royal barge on the Thames and, accompanied by an escort of honor, proceeded to the station to board the funeral train for Bladon. The cranes were under the Hayes Wharf, and the homage was praised as a gesture of respect in an unrehearsed and spontaneous action. Squadrons of military aircraft flew over the barge, and a farewell salute was fired from the tower. The funeral ceremony in Bladon took place according to a script written in advance by Churchill himself. The funeral took place in a narrow circle of family and a few very close friends. Upon entering Bladon, the hearse was met by boys from the surrounding villages, each of them carrying a candle. The vicar of the parish church officiated at the mass, after which the coffin was lowered into the grave, upon which was placed a wreath of roses, gladiolus, and lilies gathered in a nearby valley. A handwritten inscription on the ribbon of the wreath read, "From a grateful motherland in the British Commonwealth of Nations, Queen Elizabeth." In 1965, a memorial plaque was placed on the floor of Westminster Abbey to the memory of Winston Churchill and to commemorate the 25th anniversary of the Battle of Britain by Reynolds Stone. As you can see, Winston Churchill really was a legendary personality. Not always making the right decisions and facing the vicissitudes of life, he always recovered from failures and created history. Should he be idealized because of his right actions? Probably not. However, it's necessary to honor him and the legacy he left behind. That's all for today. We hope you enjoyed our video. We promise many more interesting stories about legendary historical figures without whom this world would be completely different today. Click on the icons that appeared on your screen for watching more videos. You are watching the Biographer History channel. See you again on the pages of history.